As Hope mentioned, my name's Martin Bourque. I'm the Executive Director at the Ecology Center. How many of you have heard of the Ecology Center before? Oh, good. So a few, and I get to tell a few more of you about the fine work of this organization. I've been there since 2000, and I'm sort of a product of both Earth Day and the Ecology Center. I grew up here in Berkeley, and people in and around the Ecology Center formed my early years. I'll maybe talk a little bit about that. But what I wanted to take the time today to talk a little bit about is where did Earth Day start, what got it going, and what's happened to it since, and where can we go with it from here. So just thinking about it, it's been around since 1970. How many of you participated in the first Earth Day? Were born before the first Earth Day? A few. Yeah, so, you know, for many of us, Earth Day just has been here as part of the annual schedule of things that comes out. You know, you got Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Earth Day. It's just in the mix. But we never really talk about what it was, how it started. And I think it's important to start with the context of what was happening in 1970 and why Earth Day emerged as such an important day and then also movement following that. It was really, in many ways, the birth of the modern environmental movement. And this photo, or one like it, was the first time that humans had seen the planet from outside itself. And it was taken in the run-up to putting a human on the moon. And it really had a profound impact on human psyche around the globe, because for the first time you could see, you know, that it was just a thin blue veneer around the surface of this thing where all the life on Earth happens. And suddenly, all of the things that seem so disparate and separate and disconnected when you're just standing on one point on Earth, you could see it all together. And I think it had a very profound impact on people because they were also experiencing things like rivers being on fire, the Erie Canal was on fire, the air pollution in our cities was horrific, you know, really bad, much worse than you might even find in modern cities like Los Angeles. Anybody experience smog in LA today? It's pretty bad, but back then it was even way worse. Our water was in real crisis. Our lakes were poisoned with acid rain. So there was just there were far fewer regulations on industry, and the sort of Western Judeo-Christian Protestant orientation towards the planet was it was there to serve us, and we were in the dominant species, and we were in control of it, and that worked up to a point, but you know, you start reaching those limits. At this time was also limits of growth was starting to come out, these ideas that we couldn't just grow forever. Silent Spring, anybody know this book? It's a really important book in the history of the environmental movement. Rachel Carson did really deep scientific research on the impact of pesticides on birds. And Silent Spring is the central story of it is how DDT was destroying the eggshells of birds, and they would sit on the eggs and the eggs would collapse. And the prediction was that if we kept going in that direction, we would not have any birds in spring, and it would be a silent spring. Very impactful book, and lots of organizations emerged out of work around pesticides because of this book. Also, the political environment at the time was really charged. It was a very intense time. And I've just put up here, these are all riots that happened between 1967 and 1969 in the United States. Most of them were race riots. A good chunk of them happened after the assassination of Martin Luther King. There were maybe 15 riots in 15 cities across the country. And I'm talking about where cities were burned. You know, you think of, maybe you've seen images from Watts or Detroit. Whole sections of town were just lit on fire, burned, trashed, destroyed. National Guard was called out. But I'll note that towards the end of the 60s, the last few, we had the People's Park riots. Maybe some of you would remember the National Guard coming down Shattuck Avenue or up University around People's Park. There were the Stonewall riots in New York City around gay rights. And then the Days of Rage. And this was really when the Weathermen split from SDS and they went on an underground. So a lot of the organizations that were organizing SDS and SNCC and other organizations that had come up through civil rights got really radicalized. The Black Panthers, the Black Liberation Front. Out of all of that, people got very they moved from a period of nonviolent protest into some really pretty radical, by any means necessary approaches. And so that's the context that Earth Day was happening in. The Ecology Center was founded in the run-up to the first Earth Day, and it was people coming out of the new social movements, impacted by that first image I put up, and also by Rachel Carson and others. They put out this poster. This was in 1969. This poster came out, and it was calling attention to the fact that there was 2 to 6 times the amount of DDT in breast milk in women as was found in cow's milk. And that really breast milk at this time was pretty polluted and pretty dangerous stuff. And this, as you can see, a high impact image for 1969, even by today's standards, pretty racy. But that was the milieu that Earth Day came out of. People were pretty intense and pretty serious about the issues. The Ecology Center, as I mentioned, was founded in the run-up to the first Earth Day. Earth Day, the idea was initially a teach-in, and it was founded by Gaylord Nelson, who was a senator in Wisconsin. And he was frustrated after years of being governor and then senator of not being able to advance environmental legislation. He partnered with a California Republican conservationist, and they sort of created this bipartisan teach-in idea. It gathered its own steam from there. They hired a guy named Dennis Hayes, who's still somewhat involved in the Earth Day Network and other things. And they organized a mass demonstration and the kickoff of a movement that turned out 20 million people at over 2,000 places around the U.S. This is the largest mass mobilization in U.S. history and the largest mass mobilization until the Women's March last year. So, people really turned out for this thing. And it started, as I said, as an educational thing, but it was in this political context. There was no way that it wasn't going to be a very political and activist-oriented event. And so there were events all over the country like this. This is Philadelphia, but you had D.C., New York City, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, Chicago, go down the list. Universities were critical in this. There were thousands of universities that were organizing Earth Day events. And as I mentioned, here in Berkeley, the organizations that got behind it were people who got behind it ended up starting Ecology Action and the Ecology Center in Berkeley. And like Berkeley, many other cities were doing the same thing. So in Ann Arbor, in Boulder, in Austin, all these college campuses around the country, in Cambridge, they were all organizing around Earth Day, and many organizations got started in that run-up, and the Ecology Center in Berkeley was one of them. New York Times, millions join Earth Day. I mentioned that, it was pretty intense, like the imagery, the street theater, the organizing was pretty radical and pretty intense. Some of the key elements of the first Earth Day was that it was bipartisan. There were Republican and Democratic supporters behind it. As I mentioned, there was this sort of, congressional element to it that was a little maybe more mainstream, and then there were more radical civic organizations and student organizations. Had a very deep political orientation. There was mass mobilization involved in terms of just turning people out. It had three kind of key content areas. There was a lot of volunteerism involved, so there was a lot of street cleanup or beach cleanup or let's just clean this up. And so if you Google Earth Day 1970, you'll see people with brooms or picking up stuff. That was kind of the emergence of recycling as well. It was a big focus on solid waste and things that individuals could do. And then there was a big focus just on sort of speaking truth about environmental issues. So there were a lot of scientists that came out and spoke on the research they were doing and the impacts they were finding of, particularly about industry's impact on the environment, on air, on water, and on our land. Pretty quickly out of Earth Day, a lot of people got busy organizing in terms of campaign, in terms of political campaigns, in terms of organizing around the vote. The Earth Day was in April, the elections were in November. There was a dirty dozen list of congressmen who had stymied pretty much every piece of environmental legislation that was put forward through the 1960s. And so the organizers had their hit list. And for November, they organized people, they turned people out. They voted two really important Democratic representatives out of office based on their environmental voting record. And by December, Nixon was signing the Environmental Protection Act. It sent shockwaves. This 20 million people coming out in the street, and then the impacts it had that election cycle sent a very clear message to Washington, and that really turned a lot of things around in DC. Suddenly, everybody's calling up Nelson Gaylord saying, hey, I want to be an environmentalist too. How can I get involved? And out of that came, as I mentioned, the Environmental Protection Act, which was an executive order by the President of the United States. It didn't go through Congress. The Clean Air Act of 1970. Critical piece of environmental legislation. This is how we have been able to regulate the smokestacks around the country, how we have been able to improve automobile emissions, how we've been able to take on fence line battles around the refineries and petrochemical industries and other factories. The Clean Water Act came a little later, but this was the legislation that allowed things like the battle to clean up Love Canal. Without the Clean Water Act, there would have been no legal framework to be able to take on cleaning up some of America's most polluted waters, and also dump sites where they were just openly dumping. That's exciting. Where they were openly dumping very toxic and hazardous chemicals. And then finally, the Endangered Species Act. And the Endangered Species Act, probably one of the most important in terms of protecting our wildlands, our open space, because it not only said that the species was important, but that its habitat was important. And so this came to a head most visibly, perhaps, during redwood summer and the fight to save old-growth redwoods in the Pacific Northwest, because the spotted owl was an endangered species, and it lived only in these old redwood forests. And so it became an icon, sort of the corporate guy from Maxam or whatever company ended up buying them versus the spotted owl and this sort of, damn problem with the owl that they had. It wasn't, and the environmentalists, of course, were all focused on the whole picture of how do we save this whole ecosystem of these ancient redwood forests. A lot has changed in Earth Day. If you look around the country today or around the globe, it's a global thing. I encourage you to check out Earth Day Network. I think they have something like 200,000 events going on around the planet today. Millions of people involved. Primarily, it's focused on volunteerism. A lot of cleanup, shoreline cleanup, park cleanup, litter removal, tree planting, that kind of stuff. And a lot of education, so lots of tabling. It's when all the environmental groups get to come out and sort of meet the public more broadly. These are very important, valuable things, primarily sponsored with large corporate entities who are sort of footing the bill. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the problems with that when your corporate sponsors are Shell and Chevron, and they're trying to portray a very positive public image of themselves, as they were particularly, by the end of the 70s into the early 80s, they really had a solid grip on how to do this. I don't know if many of you remember the Chevron ad series about people caring. Do people really go all this extra effort to save the endangered American, the golden eagle or the bald eagle? People do. We put these extra landing things on our power lines so they won't get fried when they try and land on our high tension wires. Our approach at the Ecology Center was like, look, Chevron, if you really want to support Earth Day, clean up your own factory, stop polluting the people right around your factory, which is a real issue right here in Richmond and in the Bay Area. So, and that goes on today, with a lot of that kind of corporate sponsorship on the one day of the year to focus on cleaning up a beach or a park or something. Meanwhile, what's happening at the factory, they're battling against caps that we want to get on total emissions from refineries in the Bay Area, for example. So, where does that leave us today? This is Earth Day 2018. The focus is on ending plastic pollution, which the Ecology Center has been working on plastics for since they were proposed to be recycled in the early 1990s. And it's a challenging space, and I'll talk a little bit about what's happening with plastic and where we are today and where we're going. Just as a thought, too, about what we can actually do with Earth Day and how we can take it forward into the future. I want to go back just for a minute to here. I've had a lot of conversations about Earth Day with a lot of current environmental leaders over the last few years about, can we really bring it back as a political movement? Can we really elevate its the intensity around it to actually create some change? Can we avoid some of the complexities of having large corporate sponsors and then the kind of self-censorship that often comes from the events as a result? A lot of the other organizers that I've talked to feel that at this point, Earth Day is really great as it is. Have it be focused on education, environmentalism. It's a great first point of contact for lots of people. It's a way to get kids involved. It's a platform to talk about all kinds of different issues. But talking to, for example, 350.org and Bill McKibben, they're like, as soon as you run that event 2 or 3 times, you're going to be back in the same place where you need the money to run the event. And unless you can find really progressive sponsors with enough money to really help you get there, then those other sponsors are going to start to become part of it. And whether that's a Wells Fargo, where you have to raise concerns about mountaintop removal and mining and all the other things that they've done that are pretty horrific in the last 5-10 years, or whether it's an oil company, or whether it's a consumer packaged product company like Procter & Gamble or Target, a big retailer, Walmart. You start getting into some really tricky places in terms of what you can say and what you can do without alienating your sponsors. And so while the sponsors may not be coming down with a heavy hand and saying, don't talk about this, or don't critique us on that, or if you say this, then we'll pull our money. But, as organizers and as people in the movement, you start to kind of say, oh, maybe we shouldn't say that. And so there is a lot of self-censorship that can emerge. So, that's partly why you see 350.org. They don't try and do a big Earth Day thing. They're organizing a rally in D.C. and getting arrested in D.C. on a completely different day than Earth Day. So it's sort of like, let's keep doing Earth Day, but let's also do these other days of action. And that way, be able to keep a little independent from the trappings of this sponsorship. The other thing that's happened over the last 40 plus years is that cities have really taken on Earth Day. So you'll find a lot of cities around the country that are actually the organizer of Earth Day, or they're the lead agency on Earth Day. So for example, Oakland's having a big Earth Day volunteer day, day of action and participation. And it's the city of Oakland that's really kind of the main lead behind that. So you'll often have city staff either in Parks and Rec or maybe in the Public Works Department who are taking on Earth Day and helping to organize or supporting other groups who are going to be the leads on organizing it. That's really important, that cities have a role in environmental issues and are seeing themselves as agents of environmental protection. But again, cities can't be as radical, and they can't get involved in political campaigning for, election campaigning, for example. I did want to mention, as we think about the future and where we go with Earth Day, we have our own dirty dozen list today. And if you look at who the climate deniers are, even in California, there's a good list of our federal representatives who are outspoken climate deniers coming from the state of California. So thinking about how to get back some of those original elements, I think is really important as we look from April towards November and thinking about how can we really put our intention towards change. So back to plastics and plastic pollution. How many of you know that there's a giant floating vast amount of plastic in each of the 5 oceans on the planet? I would say that's one of the major accomplishments of environmental groups in the last 5 years is that everybody knows that we have a problem with plastic. Pretty much everyone in the US has heard that we are dumping millions of tons of plastic into the ocean annually, and that it doesn't go away. So what you may not, and our levels of knowledge are getting much more refined about that. So first it was there's plastic in the Pacific, and then it was, oh, there's plastic in these other oceans too. And then it was, oh, it's not just, this big island of garbage, it's sort of this smog that's, melting into the ocean and it's diffuse. And then it was, oh, it's also getting into the food web. The zooplankton are eating it, the krill are eating it, larger mammals and marine life are eating it, and it works its way up the food chain. And then we learned, oh, these microplastics in the ocean are also amazing sponges for persistent organic pollutants, what we call POPs. These are things like the old DDT that's still out there, or old dioxin that's still out there, or brominated flame retardants, or a whole host of really pretty horrific toxins that are diffuse in the ocean waters. And these plastics act as like magnets or sponges for them, and they grab onto them and they hold them. That creates some potential benefit in that they're concentrating those out of the rest of the ocean. The problem is that as they get eaten and move up the food chain, they concentrate, what we call bioaccumulation. So when a sardine eats 10,000 little tiny zooplankton, all of those little bits accumulate in that sardine. When a salmon eats 10,000 sardines in its life, or whatever it is, all those little bits then accumulate in that salmon. When we eat that salmon, we're getting potentially a pretty serious toxic dose from seafood. They've now found these plastic bits in 40 different species of shell food, things that we eat, from mussels and oysters and shellfish to shrimp to other kinds of fish right up the food chain. So it's been an evolution of learning what that plastic in the ocean actually means, and it moving from, oh, there's a problem with litter out there somewhere where I can't see it, and it doesn't really bug me that much, except if I go to the beach and I see some on the beach, and that bothers me, to, oh, it's getting in our food, and now it's raising questions about whether I should be eating seafood, which has been a part of my diet since I was a child, or since my ancestors ate it. So that level of understanding and the level of knowledge around what the problems with plastic are has been growing dramatically in the last 5 years, and people across the country have a pretty high level of awareness about the problem. I would say some other things that you might not know is that plastics in the soil is being studied, and that is also an increasing problem. We're finding that plastic from paint, plastic from tires, plastic from clothing, these things all can end up both in your house in terms of household air quality, but also in our soils. So we're finding it in the air, we're finding it in the soil, and we're finding that some of these pollutants that are attached to plastics can also migrate up the terrestrial food chain. So that's all very new science. It's just being studied, and it's difficult science to sort out, but we're finding that. So as we all push towards, well, why don't we turn everything compostable and put it in the compost bin, we also have to think about the terrestrial, the land-based destinations of that stuff, and do we want that applied on the sides of freeways where no one's going to eat that landscaping, or do we want it in our food system in terms of it going back into agricultural land? Where are appropriate applications for that municipal compost? What's going into it? Because right now we also have a huge push to try and get the compost out of our garbage and to reduce our food waste. So, we get into this space of sort of competing priorities, and how do we keep it out of one place versus another. So at the Ecology Center, going back to sort of plastic and plastic bags, for 30, 40 years, we always said the question is not paper or plastic. That's really asking the wrong question. We should be, the answer is really bring your own bag. And it took us a very long time to get there, but through leadership here in the city of Berkeley and Alameda County, we managed to find a bag reduction ordinance that was so successful here that it was later adopted at the whole state of California level. So, they said the world would end without these disposable plastic bags, but it seems like we're doing just fine without them. I would say, another arena in that, another item in that arena is styrofoam. Incredibly difficult material to handle. It's super lightweight, it blows around, it has very low value, it's often contaminated with food. So in terms of being able to do something with it from a recycling perspective, it's very difficult material to handle. In Berkeley, we banned it in 1986 because of its association with problems with the ozone depletion at the time. That helped to send a very clear message to the fast food industry that we didn't want all of the food packaging to go into styrofoam. People said the world would end. Here we are, 30 years later. We're doing just fine without styrofoam in Berkeley. So over 100 cities in California have passed a styrofoam ban. Last year, we tried to get one through the state legislature that would have covered the whole state of California. The styrofoam industry, led by the global leader of it, as a company you should know, its name is DART. DART was able to stymie that legislation and stop the statewide ban. They've now gone around the country passing preemptive laws state by state to prevent other cities and states from adopting styrofoam bans. And they currently have legislation in California that seeks to undermine the bans through a different mechanism that I can talk about if we still have some time. So I've talked a little bit about the environmental problems with disposable foodware, and I want to focus on that as a source of plastic pollution. You'll notice on this graphic, I don't know if you can see it very well, but a lot of these have to do with foodware and food packaging. We're seeing growth in plastics in every single sector of the consumer good economy, but the growth of convenience foods and plastic packaging together has been so dramatic and so fast that the systems that we used for collecting newspaper, recycling newspaper, cans, bottles, glass, that infrastructure really isn't built for the kind of plastic that they're cranking out today. And out of that first Earth Day, in addition to all of the legislation that started, all these local programs got started. So the Ecology Center is it's a community-based organization. The idea was that every community should have a place where people can get together, get active, get involved, get motivated on local issues that tie into some broader global thing. And pretty quickly, there are about 30 of them around the country. A number of them still exist today. Many other communities have an organization like that that's not called the Ecology Center. But out of that sort of milieu came a number of programs. The first one was the curbside recycling program. And the Ecology Center's people in and around the Ecology Center started the nation's first curbside recycling program, 1973. And the Ecology Center still runs that program today. So every day we send out 8 trucks and 8 drivers to go collect curbside recycling from one part of the city, and we bring it back, sort it out, and with our partner community conservation centers, package it up and sell it off to be recycled. Over the years, as an environmental organization, we've tried to really keep the environmental values of that recycling program true. So in Berkeley, we have a divided cart. How many of you live in Berkeley and use one of our split carts? It has a butterfly lid. It keeps the paper and the glass separate. This is really important in terms of having high-quality materials that can actually be made into something else. The single-stream recycling that took over most of the country, where you just have one bin and everything goes in it, and there's a lot of wish cycling that happens where people wish something could be recycled, so they put it in there. That worked while we had really strong export markets for a lot of our recyclables. So for the last 20, 30 years, China wanted all of our plastics. They wanted all of our mixed paper. Over the last 5 years, they've basically gone from, we're kind of not so into importing your garbage anymore, to we don't want it at all and we're not going to take it anymore. And that's where we're at today in 2018, is that China has banned all imports of scrap plastic and a number of types of paper and cardboard and other things. That's really a game changer for recycling. That means that we can't just sort of sort it out and then export our problems to somebody else. We're going to have to really figure that out, and that's going to be a challenge economically for recycling because we've driven sort of towards the cheapest, low-intensity types of recycling around the country. And we've really focused on convenience and ease and we've had tremendous buy-in again from the packaged good industry who wants all of their products to have a recycling chasing arrow on it so that people feel good when they purchase it. And a lot of those things aren't very recyclable or have very low value as a material or are hard to sort or are multiple materials. I'll give you a good example. How many of you are familiar with those little coffee pods, the K-pods? You can make a single cup of coffee with those. It's a plastic cup filled with coffee grounds and then sealed with a foil lid. From a recycling perspective, there's nothing we can do with that. It's got foil and plastic, which in large volumes and in big pieces are recyclable, but in tiny little bits are very hard to handle. And then it's full of coffee, which should go in the compost bin. Well, the manufacturer and inventors of K-pods really want that to be included in recycling programs because they want people to feel that they can purchase this product and use it and still not be doing something bad for the environment. And so they've fought really, really, really hard to get that included into recycling programs. it's just not something that's ever really going to be a viably recyclable product. And there's so many things like that on the market today where the manufacturer is really trying to get a green seal of approval on their package so that consumers who want environmentally friendly packaging will feel good about it and purchase the product. So at the Ecology Center, we feel trying to recycle all these new kinds of plastic is a losing game. Most of it is really, it's a fool's errand trying to sort it out. It becomes very costly, and the environmental success of recycling those things is highly questionable. Right now, all the mixed plastic that we bale up, we used to send to a facility in China where we had direct line of sight, and we knew that it was being processed at a pretty high level. There were good air and water controls and good labor standards. Today, because of the ban, we sell to a broker in Hong Kong, and they sell to brokers throughout Southeast Asia. We don't really know today what the final destination of those plastics is, and we're very concerned that there could be a race to the bottom in finding the cheapest possible way to dispose of those plastics. So our vision is recycling is important. We need to do it. It's important for all these different reasons and all these different materials, but it isn't a single solution for everything. Really important to remember, reduce, reuse, recycle is a hierarchy. They're not three independent pillars. You're supposed to start with reduction, start with reuse, and if you can't solve your problem there, then you move into can it be recycled? What we've done over the last 20, 30 years is skip those first two and go straight to recycling as the solution. And what China, this change in the Chinese market is telling us, particularly on the West Coast, is we can't do that anymore. So we really have to focus on reuse. And at the Ecology Center, some of our programs are really orienting towards bringing reuse back. We want to see reusable food containers, product containers. How about eliminating packaging altogether that's unnecessary? Sometimes the packaging just looks really pretty, and it's great from a marketing perspective, but isn't really necessary. So here's some of the other problems. It's with disposable foodware. We found in a survey of street litter in the Bay Area that 2/3 of street litter is from food businesses. It's straws, lids, containers, cups, utensils, stirrers. That stuff makes it straight into our storm drains, ends up in the waterways, goes out into the bay, into the ocean, and then we go out on Earth Day and clean it up in the best of worlds. But it's very, in Berkeley, we're doing an amazing job of cleaning that stuff up. We have a number of business districts. They're all paying people to go out and pick up litter on the streets. We have the Public Works Department that collects at the trash cans all throughout the city and a street sweeping program. And then we have these storm drains that just spent millions of dollars installing new storm drain capture systems to capture this stuff. By 2023, we're supposed to have zero litter to the bay. It's an incredibly hard task to achieve, and it's going to cost a lot of money. Currently, we have a ballot measure that Berkeley voters are voting on to increase the fee on stormwater, for our stormwater fees, to pay for a lot of this compliance work. We know that it's polluting the ocean, that it's very costly to recycle. Voluntary solutions have really failed. In other cities, we've looked at a lot of voluntary solutions, and we know that cities have to lead on this. We're not going to get leadership, certainly from the federal government and even at the state level, as we saw with the styrofoam ban last year. We're not going to be able to get the kind of legislation that's necessary. You guys have all seen images like this on social media of the really horrific impacts of plastic pollution, not just out in the ocean, but in many of the waterways that people live off of where they fish. This is actually a fishing boat where people fish, where they live. This is the outthrows from a recycling facility across the road, a paper recycling facility. And all the plastic is in China. They just go across the street and dump it. And then there are people digging through that trying to eke a living off of that waste. But you can see that it's going nowhere fast and eventually may just get lit on fire, or then the monsoons come and wash it into the waterways. But a lot of it starts here and ends up, and it starts here. And so we have a vision of how can we reduce this waste rather than trying to recycle or compost it. This is an image from Clean Water Action, who goes around and does support work with restaurants to get them to reduce disposables for in-house dining. This is a meal service for in-house dining. It's got a grilled sandwich in a cardboard box with a soup in a cup and a slaw in a cup and a drink in a cup. When you finish this meal, you have in front of you a pile of garbage. I mean, it may be recyclable or compostable, but it's very low-grade stuff. Not going to have a lot of value. And it's food contaminated. And for me as a business person, this would drive me crazy because here I am paying for all of that. That probably costs $1 in terms of the foodware. So I'm paying to get rid of it and raising the cost of food. I mean, I'm paying to give it out, and then it goes in the garbage can and I have to pay to get rid of it. This is the same meal or a similar meal without any disposables, using all reusables. So our proposal is let's move from the disposable model back to reusables, particularly for in-house dining. And Tuesday night, City Council will be considering an ordinance that we've worked on very closely. In the 2016 election, our mayor, who just joined us, and other council members, he'll be speaking in a moment, and other council members ran on they included zero waste in their platform, and we're really grateful that they have focused on reinvesting in Berkeley's infrastructure for zero waste, meaning our recycling facility and our transfer station, where we're able to capture and sort all these materials down at 2nd Street. It's long overdue for a rebuild, and they've focused on that, but they've also said, we don't just want to recycle everything, and we know we can't recycle our way to zero waste. We have to reduce. So what can you propose to us that might help with reducing some of the most problematic types of waste? And so this is an ordinance that will be considered by City Council on Tuesday. We hope they will recommend sending it to the Zero Waste Commission for further work. But it has 3 major components. The first is it would require restaurants to only use reusables for in-house dining. So get rid of all that disposable stuff if you're eating in-house. Second, for takeout, it would require all the takeout containers to either be truly recyclable or compostable. And this includes phasing out some of the hazardous chemicals that are in both compostable and plastic containers. The third element is a charge. So how many of you bring your own coffee cup when you get coffee out? Anybody? Few? And sometimes when you take your coffee cup, you get a discount. It's like 10 cents typically. This proposes that rather than getting a discount, if you don't bring your own cup, you'd be charged a fee of 25 cents. And the same for a container. So it's designed to try and promote the use of reusable cups and containers, and also the businesses keep this money and it can help offset some of the costs of the improved disposable containers that might go out for takeout. Finally, how many times have you ordered takeout and you get home and you look in the bag and you ordered one meal but you've got 8 forks in there and 27 little packets and a handful of napkins? So the ordinance would also require that things like straws, utensils, napkins would be by request only and or at a self-service station. So I'll wrap up with where can we go with Earth Day, and I like this. This is from the Huffington Post today, and I encourage folks to go look at it. It's an opinion piece. This year Earth Day is on November 6th. And this kind of gets back to the roots of what we were talking about earlier. I think the most radical and environmental thing people could do today is go out and vote and register your friends and family to vote. You can do it online. It's really fast and easy. There's a dirty dozen out there. Look it up. Right here in California, we've got about a dozen representatives, federal representatives, who are outspoken climate deniers. Those people need to go, you know, and sending a clear message in November that if you're not for the environment, you can't get reelected, will really change things again in Washington, D.C. Same is true in the state of California. You know, there are a lot of opportunities coming up this November. We have a new governor, or we will have a new governor out of this election. There's some great candidates. Which of them are really going to be our best champions for the environment? I encourage you to check out the League of Conservation Voters. They're doing a bunch of work around the governor's races, and they'll be doing forums around that. We have our own elections. We have great people running for office this fall who are going to be our real champions for the environment locally. Let's vote for them. Let's support them. So I don't know how to make the first Earth Day in November, this 2018, but that's where I would like to go with it. So thank you.